jumping back in with the big tour video, this area around the other side of the screen porch would be the northwest little pocket here. And so there are times of the year that gets almost no sun in here, but this time of the year the sun's tracking a hair north, and when it gets over here, a lot of this stuff's in a lot of sun for a little while. But we do have a little pocket back here that gets very little direct sun that we have some shade things in. The other thing about the north and that northwest side like that is that it maintains a little more moisture. Most of our shade out here in the garden is very dry. I mean, just really a lot of root competition and open space. And, you know, so the things we have to choose for the shade are it's a limited number of things that will really tolerate those conditions. This is the moist shade area over here. And so pretty much anything, you know, all the hostas and other things that like that, those kinds of conditions, sedum, lots of things that like this kind of well-drained but consistently moist shady spaces, you know, thrive in here, but it's very limited. I wish I had a little more space like this. There are a few containers on the edge of the steps, and a couple of these are aloes from the Southern Living Plant Collection. It's been raining. We've finally gotten decent rain here. Over the course of shooting these tour videos, we started out just unbelievably dry, and we've been shooting these for a couple of weeks now at this point. This is like number 12 or something that we've shot. And we've gotten a lot of rain this past week, maybe as much as a couple inches yesterday, probably 5 inches this week. These aloes, they're great as container plants. They need to come in the dead of winter for us, but we don't bring them in until late fall, until it gets really cold, because it's actually shorter days and cooler nights that make the aloe bloom. If I brought it in too early, if I brought it in with all the other houseplants, we wouldn't get any flowers on it, or we just get a few. So we'll leave them out here till it's quite cold. They can take a lot of cold. They just won't take our full winter cold. So they'll be out here till about Christmas, and they'll just bloom like crazy starting usually around mid-October, mid to late October. Great plants, great container plants. They seem to thrive when they're hair root bound. So both of them have been in those containers for a little while, but the flowers are spectacular on both of them. There's a Thuja placata in this container called whipcord, and you can see why it's called whipcord. It's been eaten a little bit by a creeping jenny that's in here, and we'll save it, you know, from being eaten, from the creeping jenny climbing up in it occasionally. But they look good together. This will eventually go in the ground, but it's a small, you know, thread-like Thuja or arborvita. But the Western arborvitas tend to be a little more heat tolerant overall than the Western arborvitas tend to be a little more heat tolerant than the Eastern arborvitas. But I really like that container. I think this hosta is Golden Tiara. It's one that's, we did a hosta and hydrangea video a couple of months back. I don't remember if we included that one in it or not. There were quite a few hosta that didn't show up in it, but that one looks great. And again, it's slightly moist over here in comparison to the other shady spaces that are in the gardens. Here's a slightly closer view of that hosta, and then behind it, we stuck this Charlie Boy cordyline in the ground for the summer, because it had been in a pot for a couple of years, and we didn't want to throw it out. But it's a really neat cordyline, and it's been outside. We've never brought this thing in the house. It's been outdoor hardy in the ground for us. It has this beautiful striping. And it's got a little pup down at the bottom. Maybe we'll start over with one in a container next year from that growth that's down right down at the bottom. If we can get that into the video there, that little piece of side growth down at the bottom. But again, there was a spot there. Steph stuck it in there because it was just a space to put it, because we didn't know if we were going to reuse it in a container project or not. The Camellia here is a Camellia sasanqua, and it's October Magic Orchid. It's one of my favorite of Bobby Green's camellias. I just like the foliage on these things. They're so nice. They're just so clean. You can see the flower buds coming. We're shooting this, you know, now at this point, 2/3 of the way through July, and this is when the flower buds really start to form on these Camellia sasanquas. You got to be careful cutting them, you know, after mid-spring or so, because this growth is only about 4, 5, 6 leaves, the new growth on it this year, and then it forms those flower buds for the fall. This one's kind of a two-tone flower. Great plant. I mean, just as whether it flowered or not, this is just a great looking Camellia sasanqua, which is true with all of his. You'll see it. We'll see a few more as we go here in the garden. We've saw a few in the early tour videos. As he's picking them for as much for the shape and the size and the, you know, the foliage as anything. You know, the flowers are great, but they're kind of secondary when something only flowers for 2 months out of the year. Camellias are pretty long flowered compared to other things, but it's still only 2 months, 2.5 months, something like that. And the rest of the year, you know, it just looks like that. It disappears kind of into the background, makes everything else in the bed stand out really well. A couple of interesting conifers over here. We're in zone 8A in Raleigh, North Carolina, so blue spruce are not typically, we don't see a lot of them around the area, but we see the occasional blue spruce. We're right on the southern edge of where they'll perform well. This one's getting some direct sun on it after lunch for a few hours, and that's about it. And then its roots are pretty well shaded by the things around it, by the camellia and hosta and a few annual flowers that are in front of it, and that prevents it from overheating during the summer. I mean, we had a 106-degree day here 3 weeks ago. It's not good blue spruce weather for sure, but it's done fantastic. It's, you know, it's a dwarf one. It's only grown, I don't know, 6 inches total since it went in the ground, which is kind of perfect for this little space that it's occupying. But we do have one blue spruce out here in the garden. Over to the left of it is a Camellia obtusa, which we have several of in the garden. And boy, there's so many varieties, cultivars that have interesting foliage. This one's called Melody. Get a bit of a reddish hue to it in the winter time, but then all the new growth is this kind of chartreuse color, new growth on it. Really interesting. All the Camellia obtusas are really soft to the touch. So great little plant. We had it in a container for a year or two. Just moved it to the ground. That's true with a lot of our conifers out here. We'll buy them as little dwarf conifers in tiny pots if we can find them. Put them in a container and then allow them to stay in the container for a couple years. Then they go in the ground, and it keeps them from putting any size on for a long time. And then they, you know, can stay out here in a very small garden here and we can enjoy them for a long time. We have a lot of conifers. If you follow this whole tour around the garden, it ends up being quite a lot of them. This border we typically do with pentas. Right here, we got pink, white, and kind of a darker, well, I say a darker pink, a lighter pink, and white. I stole the white ones out for a container project. That's why you're not seeing the white ones. And then Angelonia. There's a purple Angelonia, a white Angelonia, and a pink Angelonia in this border. And then we actually had a Kufia come back from seed, which I think, you know, normally we don't have many of the Kufias come back from seed, but this one did. This is Sriracha Rose, right? Yeah, this Sriracha Rose Kufia, which we've used for several projects out here in the garden. I think we had a few planted right here last year, like 3 in a cluster, and they've seeded themselves in here. And they're great annual for hummingbirds and for the bees as well. And then there's some Juncus planted in here, Twister. It's got a little twisted stems. I used to sell a ton of these at my garden center for people to use in container projects for the summer, and they're actually quite hardy. You can put them in the ground and they'll get bigger in time. Grass, you know, Juncus isn't a real grass, but it's grass adjacent. You know, it looks like a grass, right? But with really interesting new growth. This Chinese sedum has been an absolute bully in the space that it's occupying. It's underneath this windmill palm. It gets yellow flowers on it, and we had a chartreuse color sedum in here for a year. They played really nicely together, and it was really interesting to have the two sedums growing together. But ultimately, this one is a bully. It tries to go everywhere through this bed. Eventually, we're going to remove it at some point, but it is a nice looking ground cover. And when we had the open house out here, everybody was drawn to it. Everybody wanted to know what it was. And I was like, you can grab a handful, but you can regret it later. Because I mean, literally a handful is a small piece of this is all you'd need. It likes this moist, more consistently moist space than the rest of the garden. And it just goes absolutely wild. Somehow we ended up with this being the an Asian section of the garden. We have tons of native plants in this garden, but there is a kind of a collection here of things that are from Asia, including the windmill palm. This palm was, you measure palms based on the actual kind of wood part of it, where this growth is coming out of the top. And so at this point, this one's about 4 feet tall, I'm gonna say. It was only about a foot tall when it went in the ground. So this year is the year it's really taken off. The actual kind of wood, more the solid structure at the bottom of it. And we're starting to now limb it up, and I actually need to get a couple off of here because we come through here to turn the water hose on and off, and this one's in the way. So I'll go ahead and I'm gonna go ahead and take these 2 bottom ones off. Took a couple more off earlier in the season, but it's starting to look like a palm, right? It was like this tall when it went in, and now it's, you know, the top of the fronds up there 7.5 feet or something. It's really starting to look like what I had intended it to look like, which was just, I want it up to the top of the porch up there. It's going to take a few more years. I've got it mounded up slightly because I knew this spot was had a tendency to stay a little more moist. So the palm itself was raised up a little bit, and that sedum has been on its roots like that the whole time. But it's taken off. I'm growing pretty well. This is a loropetalum, and I think we've made it 12 videos. No, we had a loropetalum in the last one. But I haven't had said loropetalum in all these tour videos until the last video. But this one is emerald snow. You see the flower on it. It comes into full, this is a white flowering loropetalum chinensis that has this kind of emerald green foliage on it, and that's why it's called emerald snow. Great plant, really. We moved this thing. It was across the path over there, and it was a little too tall for the spot that it was in, and we slid it across here. Hardly watered it for 3 or 4 days. I mean, really abused it, and it just had no problem coming back from that at all. But it's nice to have a dwarf white flowering green foliage loropetalum, because when I started in this business, and I've said this before, it's like they got 25 feet tall. The green loropetalum with the white flowers is how we started with loropetalum, and then the purple foliage, and then the purple foliage became more and more what everybody wanted. But this dwarf green one is super, super nice. We're just going to move around this curve on the outside, and then we'll go into the middle and talk about those things. You'll notice the occasional stone out here. We're really not trying to make the place look like it's, you know, a stone yard or anything, but we do have the occasional stones you'll see here that are to have the water hose have a place to wrap around without decapitating our plants while we're pulling the water hose around. So we can work the water hose all the way to the back line back there and just have it up against various rocks as we go. So, and I left them where they're angled down like that. So if that hose is underneath there, when I come around this way, it won't slide across there and take out all the annuals and other things, which, you know, easily happens in a garden. This is I think a good combination of texture and shapes in this area, and foliage color kind of defines a lot of what we have going on in this garden. Is just trying to, you know, not have a lot of the same leaf shapes and colors and plant shapes and all those things all together. When you have various different things like this, they each seem to stand out a little bit more on their own. There's a Dianella planted here. These are marginally hardy in our area. Really great, you know, another grass-like plant. 2 hummingbirds just came right up to me. They're right above us right now. This one's called Clarity Blue. It's in the Southern Living Plant Collection. I think it's also in the Sunset Plant Collection. Great looking blue strappy foliage on that thing. It does flower, and we've had them flower in the containers. Really interesting, delicate looking flowers on them that bloom for a long time when they bloom, similar to that aloe when it's in bloom. This is Paul's Gold Camuciferous. This is similar to Gold Mop, but was selected for heat tolerance. So we've got it out here where this section of this little bed right here is really getting cooked in the afternoon. And you'll see on Gold Mop sometimes they'll get some bleaching on the top on these chartreuse colored conifers like this, but it just burn on the top basically during the summertime. But this one does not, has that great similar weeping habit. Great in this container because it's weeping down, and then we have the wire vine pouring out from underneath it. They both look good. They both look good together there. Wire vine's another one that I really don't want down on the ground. We have some of these things in storage. We've got a little spot of it over there in front of the building, you'll see later. And that's our spot where we can go grab a piece and throw it in a container later. And that's how a lot of our ground covers are. But another one that if it hits the right spot in the ground, it can be a little aggressive. And love this container. This is one of the Michael Carr containers that we have here in the garden. I did a couple of videos with him down in Atlanta over the years. A couple begonias planted low here and there. I said it in another video. You saw all the annuals out in the front garden have just gone bozo this season. So the first 4, 5, 6 videos in this tour series, you're seeing annuals that were just gigantic. A few back here have lagged behind just a bit. So we probably should have fertilized these a couple more. And I always talk about fertilizing based on observation instead of just dumping fertilizer on them constantly. But this is one that we'll pour some liquid fertilizer on them in the next few days, especially while it's raining right now. We can get these to start to catch up a little bit. You can see Holly's laying back here in the background. She's been there for the whole video. She loves this cool stone on this patio. That's kind of her spot. The mornings have been just crazy hot here. I mean, just going outside and sweating at 7 o'clock in the morning to walk the dogs. This is a Carex called Feather Falls, and this thing is just built different. we're gonna see Everillo, the gold foliage one over here, and possibly a couple more during this series of tour videos. But Feather Falls has just got some sort of hybrid vigor in it. I met the breeder of this plant and a new one coming called Moon Falls, which is the reverse variegation of this. So Feather Falls has the kind of white on the outside and green in the middle in the stripe. If I can pull that off. But you see right there, so you got the green down the middle and the kind of off-white color on the edge. Moon Falls has the opposite of that, the green's on the outside. Moon Falls is just as vigorous as this one. One thing that's interesting about Feather Falls and Moon Falls is when they're actively growing earlier in the season, it's more of a yellow than an off-white. And then once the heat takes over during the summer, it settles into an off-white. So I've seen that Moon Falls 2 completely different ways, and I've seen this one 2 completely different ways in the same places. So it took me a minute to realize that's what's happening. It starts off kind of yellow and then fades into this, but it's just built, when I say built differently, you know, any of the other interesting Carexes that are available would still be like this big right now, and this one is 3 feet wide and 1.5 feet tall. It's just wild how much hybrid vigor. Sometimes you can mix 2 species together and you get a lesser than. You get something that's just not, you know, doesn't grow very vigorously at all. And then occasionally you can mix 2 different species together and get hybrid vigor, and they just go. It's like this plus this is more than the 2 should be combined. But that kind of explains that. This is Stellar Ruby Magnolia. Continues to be a standout here in the garden. It gets a bronze, I don't know, how would you describe it? Almost a brown flower, mauve, I guess, colored flower. They're covered up a bit when they're in bloom, so it's not a standout like showy flower, but in the evenings, the entire garden is full of this fragrance. This is incredible fragrance. This is a Camellia type magnolia. This was in its own genus for a while and then moved back over to magnolia. And there's a lot of breeding going on in these. They're not as cold hardy. You know, your deciduous magnolias that we can grow in other much colder places of the country. Most of the evergreen magnolias are, you know, just not quite as cold hardy. And this particular group, even less so than our southern magnolias, typically like zone 8 to 10, 8 to 11, something like that, or 8 and 9, 8, maybe 8 to 10. I don't know. It'll be on the screen. Great foliage on this plant and just the perfect shape. This has not been pruned even once, and we put it in this spot just hoping it would go straight north, you know, just straight up, so that we wouldn't have to prune it. Eventually I'll limit up just a bit so we can still have things tucked up under it. Incredible fragrance. And I will tell you that this plant takes a year or 2, maybe even 3 to really come into its own. And the first couple years of flowering, it was just kind of, there were a few flowers and not many. And then this past season, oh my gosh, and every evening we were like, what is that? What is that? It doesn't, you don't really smell it in the morning or early afternoon, it's late in the evening. And the entire garden smelled incredible. This is the third Selaginella species that we have in the garden, and we'd like to actually get more of them. This one's in a moist, well-drained situation, and it's going to be much, much happier than our other two that we have in the garden, although our arborvitae fern, the Selaginella over there, is doing okay in a slightly dry space. But I think they would prefer the space that this one's in, where it's going to stay a little more moist. They're just great ground cover plants, soft texture, interest at fern-like, but they're kind of their own. They're in their own little group. A few more of those begonias over there, and then a Cryptomeria japonica, which we have several. I don't know how many we've seen so far. Probably 3, and a few more to come probably. This one is called Twinkle Toes, and it stays incredibly compact. This is one of the Isley plant that we have here in the garden. We had this one in a container for 3 years, and there are Cryptomeria that get 100 feet tall. So you can see that's pretty major difference between a Cryptomeria that gets, that can grow 4 and 5 feet a year, or this one that can grow 4 or 5 centimeters a year. So that's the difference in Cryptomeria japonicas. Cryptomeria japonica or Japanese cedar. That's what the kind of the common name for them are. This one is, most Cryptomeria are really soft textured, and this one is too, but it's a little Brillo patty at the same time. It's an interesting find, and again, we'll see a couple more Cryptomeria as we go. These are great southern conifers, so some of the conifers we have in here, we're trying to push the southern boundaries on, and then there are others like Cryptomeria that actually want to be here. So there are ones that want to be here. This yarrow is a mess. This one's is Parker's Gold. Is that what it is? Yeah, Parker's Gold. It's in a bit too much shade, so it's leaning out across the path, but it blooms like crazy. We're just going to move it later this fall as it starts to die back to a perennial border on the other side of the vegetable garden, where we have a ton of perennials growing over there. It's a great variety. It's just stretching because it's up under the vitex and up under the magnolia here. But again, we've left it here all season because the pollinators absolutely love the thing. The foliage looks great. Not a bad looking plant, other than it's just located in the wrong space. Talk a little more about this vitex in just a minute, but we've tree formed it, and it's got a really interesting trunk on it. But after tree forming it, we have, I think it was 2 plants in the same container, and that second plant is trying not to give it up. and I keep having to come over here and cut these suckers out down at the base. I get them sooner than later. That'd be what I would say. Whatever you got, crepe myrtles or whatever it is, if you got suckering plants like this, it's certainly easier to get them while they're small like this. I need to get in here and dig this thing out just a hair, and I can reduce it. I can reduce this problem over time. It was eating a variegated Sarissa. Sarissa's super underused plant. I think we got that one off the, I can see the JC Arboretum tag in it. So we got that one off the little plant cart they have at the JC Ralston Arboretum. There's always deals to be had on that plant cart. Anytime we're there, we're kind of go there first when we get there, because they always got something interesting that they're propagating around the garden that you can't find everywhere else. And so again, I think when we see this variegated Sarissa out in landscapes, it's just a super nice plant, and it's perfectly happy under this part shade condition. It's getting some bright light, but it's definitely in some shade. Some chocolate chip ajuga, and it's still blooming a little later than it normally blooms. We filled in some holes and some gaps here in the garden right before we had the open house a few weeks back, and this was one of the things that went in, and it's grown quite a bit already. Again, this ajuga likes this slightly moist, well-drained conditions. Some of the other ajuga in the garden is struggling in a couple other places. Not really struggling, but definitely not putting on, this one's just really hit the ground and started growing. And there's a Salvia gregii that's probably in a hair too much shade here. It did bloom, and it's been cut back, and it'll bloom again in the fall. They're very reliable blooming, but as thin as it definitely is telling me that it would prefer to be in a hair more sun, that this vitex is allowing it right here. This is an Asian Alyssium called Kogani Fuji, and we're gonna see several native Alyssium coming up later in the tours, but there's great native and non-native Alyssium. They're just really great garden plants. The deer and rabbits tend to avoid them if you have those kind of issues, but this one's got a beautiful variegation. It's an incredibly slow growing plant. It's been there for a couple of years, and it's added some leaves and added a little bit of growth, but not a whole lot. But it looks great under here, and a lot of people were inquisitive about what it was during the open garden. This is lobelia that we did from seed. It's just it's a really easy, here's a bare spot in the garden. We had done these from seed. Here's something you can plug in there, and then it looks great all summer. If we come across a small growing conifer or leafy evergreen plant or whatever that we want to add to this spot, it's available later, but this summer it had something growing there where weeds didn't grow. So that's kind of the point of some of these little annual spaces that we have in the garden, is they're just placeholders almost for other things. This vitex, it's weeping a lot more this morning because it's rained quite a bit overnight, and the growth habit of this thing's super interesting. It's kind of a weeping vitex is the growth habit on it, and I'm gonna have to, I do a lot of pruning on this thing. This thing gives us a lot of mulch every year. It grows incredibly fast. I think during the open garden, it probably had the most bumblebees on it of anything in the garden that day. People looking up, and it's just wild. It's a little wet this morning, so they're not on it, and it's 80% bloomed out at this point, but any growth it's putting on, it's still opening new flowers. There's a bee right there on the end of that one. But anyway, it's just pretty wild. There are probably better vitex to tree form. That's what I would say. This one is probably better in just kind of a low mounding habit that it just naturally has. I have limbed it up though, and I'm going to have to continue to take weight off of it to make sure that it's not leaning down on our AC unit and other things. And this morning, again, a lot of rain yesterday caused it to come down like this. This thing blooms from the time it started in late May. It will not quit blooming until fall. It's just an incredible amount of flowers over the course of the season. It's incredibly drought tolerant. It's disease resistant. It's got, deer seem to avoid it. It has a lot of qualities that I think beat crepe myrtles overall if you're looking for a small ornamental tree. And there's a lot of different vitex, so it doesn't have to be summertime blues. But there's a lot of different vitex you can use. There's one called Flipside that has purple on the bottom of the leaves. And if you do tree form that one, you can see the purple under the bottom of the leaves. So there's just a lot of interesting vitex that we can use. And again, with some of the issues that crepe myrtles are, crepe myrtle bark scale and that kind of thing, if you're looking for a small blooming ornamental tree that blooms a long time during the summertime, you might think vitex over crepe myrtle. There's a weigela under here that we've really never talked about called Picabella rosa. It was being evaluated and was sent to us. And I don't know if it's ever going to, I did see it weirdly at a Lowe's or a Home Depot one day. We did see a few of these one time. It's a really interesting weigela. It's got slightly narrower foliage than some others. It blooms pretty well. It's a nice looking plant. Overall, it's pretty well behaved here in the garden. It's getting a little more shade than it would like. So I got kind of a little bit of stretchiness in the top of it that I wouldn't have if I had it out in a little more sun. But again, we were just kind of evaluating it and, having a conversation with the folks who sent it to us about it. And it's a nice ornamental plant. If I had to say, I think my other two weigela that were in a previous tour video, I would rank this below them for sure in terms of overall flowering. But again, I probably haven't given it a legitimate shot, in this much shade. This Akuba is called Hosaba Hoshivu. Easy for me to say. It has a narrower foliage than some of the other Japanese Akuba. When we put this in the ground, it was only maybe 12 inches tall, something like that. It was in a very small 1 gallon container. It has really thrived in this space. And so I would definitely tell you Japanese Akuba are great if you have dry shade, but boy, if you give it a little moisture, it doesn't mean it's happy in dry shade apparently, because here it is in slightly moist shade, and it's just growing like crazy, and it's just such a great pop of color here in this shady space. At some point I'm actually going to have to prune it, which I didn't think would happen, you know, in the first probably 10 years it was in the ground, but here it is 3 years in the ground, and it's quadrupled in height. So our AC unit is here, and I've got this, again, this vitex it's weeping some this morning just because it's wet, but it also just needs to be, pruned. And I told you that this thing gives us more, this thing makes more mulch than anything else in the garden, I think, which is good. You know, we like to reuse the material that we're taking off the plants, but this Beijing Beauty Mahonia definitely needs rescuing here this morning. And nice thing about this vitex, it kind of doesn't matter how I cut it. I mean, I could get in here and be real precise and detailed, but really doesn't require that. And just like that, took a little weight off of it. Another thing about this vitex is there's a window behind it there, and there's a desk there, and Steph will sit there and you can just watch. She's sitting up right above the bumblebees, so you watch the bumblebees the whole time sitting at the desk. This Mahonia, again, it's called Beijing Beauty. Really interesting growth habit. This is about as tall as it'll get. It tries to get wider from here. It blooms, I say, 6 months out of the year. It blooms in the cooler months, and it won't be long when the days start to get shorter and the nighttime temperatures get a little cooler, it'll start blooming again. We can cut this. These Mahonias and barberries, nandinas, they're all in the same plant family, and you'll notice a similar kind of growth habit to all of them. But we can take, you know, the Mahonia have this kind of layering growth habit, and you can just go down to one of the layers that's below, and it's like you didn't even cut it, you know, when you want to prune on them, if they need pruning. So if I have this kind of spiky growth coming up on it, I can go through and prune just like I just did, down to the layer that's just below it. And when you finish, you really just can't even tell you pruned it. Kind of interesting. And I need to get it away from that Akuba just a bit. This hosta, absolutely thriving, some in substance, big giant leaves on it, and it's dwarfing most of the other hosta. It's a big one, but just it's, again, this kind of well-drained, moist shade over here is like the perfect place for a hosta. And some of the other places we have hosta are just not the perfect place. They grow fine, they look great, but they're dwarven in comparison to what hosta will do in this bed. I didn't show another one on the other side of the Camellia over there. There's several, one hosta we missed, but similar kind of growth, where they're just way more vigorous over here. The flowers are bigger, you know, kind of interesting. Just moist shade. Cast iron plant, it's just literally in storage. It'll probably end up on the back line back there, but we had it in a spot where we had to move it because we were taking out the chain link fence along the side over there. And several things had to be moved really quickly, and other projects had to be done. So the cast iron plant went in the ground there. Looks good, but it's a dry shade plant, or it's a plant that will grow in dry shade, and we need those kinds of things. So it will probably move to the back line. You're going to see several other variegated cast iron plants coming up along that back line. Really interesting. That's just the regular green cast iron plant. One other thing to point out on Mahonia, and you'll see this on this family of plants in this barberry family, is that yellow wood. You see that? I don't know if it can, it'll show up on the camera, but the roots are also yellow. So when you flip one of these over, it can be a little disconcerting when you're planting barberries and Mahonia, that you'll see bright yellow roots frequently, and then when you cut them like that, the wood is yellow as well. Really kind of interesting plants. This is a Fatsia japonica called spider's web, and the variegation on this thing is just really wild. It's all over the place. We'll get really bright white variegation in here. We'll get little lighter spotting on it. This one has really started to thrive in this space. It really started to thrive. We planted it, I've said this before, we planted it late season one year. It was not a good time of year to be planting a marginal plant, because this one's, you know, kind of marginal in our area. It's tucked up against the house on purpose. And we didn't I planted it the wrong time of year. I planted it like November, and then it immediately got hit with really cold weather, and that stunted it. But this year, again, just kind of evenly moist shade over here, it just absolutely thrives. It will bloom in the fall and into the winter with these alien-like flowers on it that the bees just go absolutely nuts for. Really fun when this thing's in flower, because it looks completely alien. But the foliage is the main thing that Fatsia is typically grown for. Much bigger leaves than what's on this thing right now. It's in the process of putting on so much growth right now that these leaves have not matured. But as they mature, they'll be much, much larger than this in the future. And I imagine this thing, because of all this new growth, is going to bloom like crazy this fall. And then there's a lot of plants in this space. This space is only, what do you think, Steph, 15 by 15, something like that, 18 by 18 maybe. Little curve, little half. It's like a quarter of a pizza in this corner. There's one of the better boxwoods here. This is Babylon Beauty. Babylon Beauty may be the best low foundation. If you have a foundation where you need something that's about 36 inches high, Babylon Beauty may be the best better boxwood for those conditions. It's a low mounding one. So where we've seen the other varieties, every one of them has a slightly different shape. There's one that stays really, really small, one that gets tall and narrow, skylights you can kind of shape whatever, and then Babylon Beauty is the low mounding one that you really just, again, I said I hadn't pruned it in a year, and I don't need to, because it's going to get about this tall and slightly wider than tall. So it's kind of the perfect, we have a low foundation out front. It'll be a good plant for that. It'll be one that will be in the landscape. It'll be a great evergreen backdrop that we won't have to do any maintenance to. So there you go. There's a very small space in our urban garden here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Thank you so much for following along. We'll be back jumping over to this middle bed or the back line. I don't know which direction we'll go here, but that middle bed is probably the one that has gotten the most attention over the history of this 4-year project here in the garden. So it's coming up. Thanks for watching.